Carry on.
Yeah. Valerie, you can go ahead.
Um, okay, so I'm not a professional filmmaker, but I can make stuff. And so I've tried to make like a song documentary. That's what I'm calling it. So I interviewed like each band member about each song and I recorded. So I had the Zoom H6 as
Mhm.
like a just overall room. I just had like the main ball
Yeah.
set up. It's like a backup upon backup. I had audio from a Panasonic DVX 100B on, or maybe not that one, but a Canon 70, and then I had my iPhone audio. So I had like basically three different audios. So if anything failed, I would have some sort of backup.
Yeah.
So I was able to like edit everything and it makes like a totally fine YouTube video. But I kind of want to take my projects to the next level where I want to submit to Amazon, whatever the indie platform is, so that I'm, um, able to make it for rent for free if they have Prime or something like that.
Yeah.
Just make it look like a product beyond just a YouTube video. But what I'm understanding is like the to get the levels and everything perfect for them is very hard. What would like a price range be if I hired? I have a friend that did an audiobook for Amazon, so as far as like the sound, and he got it approved. So I'm thinking he may know how to do it as far as the film side, all the ins and outs of the perfection. But how much would you think, like at a indie level, like a 45-minute piece, to charge somebody to make the audio perfect to actually submit it to Amazon?
Do you mean like recording on set or also like
Just
mastering?
after it's done, I guess getting all the levels perfect. Because I'm okay if it being like a grungy band documentary. Like I don't necessarily need it to be like I'm fine with how it is, but I need to be able to submit it to a professional. Amazon has a name for it. I can't think of the name of it, but it's just like that indie publisher movie platform that they have. But I just know that it's beyond my skills to prepare the file for them.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say without looking at it. Usually like when I bid stuff, I don't actually give them like a hard price until like I get some sort of export because it's a lot easier for me to like listen and see what we need to do.
Mhm.
Um, Generally, though, I can tell you that audio people should, and most of us do charge at least 40 an hour. We do that because it doesn't compete with the union rate. So we're not undercutting any union members. And depending on their skill and their experience, it'll be more or less. If
Mhm.
you're just looking for a quick master, it could be done in a day, maybe. But if you're looking for anything more than that, which would sort of depend on what Amazon needs from you to get it on a platform like that. It could be, something 45 minutes. If we're doing like a really nice mix on it, that would take us probably like a month. So it sort of depends on what you need and what the specs you get for your streamer are. It's
Mhm.
going to be sort of a wide range, which I know is not very helpful, but that's
Would that
sort
be like a 40-hour week? Like if somebody was like, okay, I need $40 an hour, it's going to take me a week, would you assume that's a 40-hour week or is that what?
that
Like
it
just like
depends on the
a ballpark?
person.
I don't know.
Yeah, so like most audio people are not working on just one project at a time. Typically, we're working on multiple. So I wouldn't necessarily assume it's a 40-hour week. I think
Mhm.
that's more of like, hey, that's my time frame, but that doesn't necessarily like correspond to hours.
Mhm.
What I would do is if you have audio people who are interested, ask them for a bid where they send you like, hey, I think this is going to take me 20 hours at this rate, so it'll be this much. Um, and I think I can do it within this amount of time, basically. That's typically how most professionals bid on projects is they give like a rough schedule and then they send like a bid proposal that, says how much each stage costs. Because also like For reference, like dialogue editing, you get paid less for than re-recording mixing. So like some steps in the process are also more or less expensive because they require more or less skill and sometimes like special facilities or software.
Okay.
So
Thank
yeah,
you.
it's a little hard for me to like ballpark, but somewhere around 40 plus an hour is what you're looking at for anyone who is like a professional working in audio.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. No.
Sorry, I'm having some difficulties with my computer. I was just trying to think of like the last project I worked on and some of the issues I faced. So let's see. So let's say if you were doing like some documentary stuff and it's a you don't know what type of environment it might be,
Hmm.
what would be like a good basic setup to
Yeah.
have good quality audio?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, that's a good question. So obviously it depends on, how many subjects there are and if you know if you're going to be inside and outside, but for doc, sometimes you don't know. Sometimes you're moving like between locations very quickly, and you're not really sure how many people are going to be covered. So generally what I tell documentarians is to first off, have a good shotgun mic on top of like mounted on every single camera that's running audio recording into the camera. Actually, this doc that I'm working on tonight, it is capturing like dance performances, and so they couldn't like put microphones on the subjects because they were dancing and the mic packs were going to fall out. But they had microphones mounted onto every camera, and so usually there's like something I can work with for every scene. So that's a big thing. Is just making sure that every camera has its own like good shotgun microphone, especially because if you only have like if you've got three cameras running, but you only have one sound mixer on set, they can at least the camera operators can record something decent, even if the sound person is with B team or is with A team and not with them. Aside from that, trying to do as much like preparation as possible is really important. Again, I know with documentary, you can't always do that, but knowing like if you, for instance, like again with this dance documentary, if you know where they're going to be performing, like scope it out a couple of days ahead of time, see if there's something like a mixing board that they're going to be running the music from that you can pull a feed from instead of just like recording with a microphone in a big room where there's going to be a lot of other noise. Like if you pull a feed from a mixing board, you can get a much cleaner sound. And if you know there is a mixing board ahead of time, you know to prepare for that. And then aside from that, just trying to get a microphone on anyone that you're interviewing. Sometimes documentarians will just rely on the shotgun mic, like mounted to their camera, which is good. But if you're going to be like stopping and talking to someone for a few minutes, just like quickly ask if they're comfortable wearing a lavalier mic and toss it on. That one gives you like an extra audio source to use if something goes wonky with your shotgun mic, but then also in like busy or loud situation, lav mics can isolate a little better than shotgun mics can in some ways, just because they're closer to the source. Um, but if you're going in totally blind, like try your best with the room or with the environment. And then the other thing I'd say is just like make sure you have some kind of wind protection for your microphones if you do have to go outside, or if you are like the day you scoped out this place you're going to be shooting, it was really nice. And then you come back the day you're actually shooting and it's really, really windy. Wind is something we can't deal with really well in post production. And it's something that I've noticed happens kind of frequently on documentary sets as they like prep for everything except for wind. And so they'll start rolling and you just hear this like low level distortion on all the microphones because there's just a ton of wind going on in the outside location. So shotgun mics on tops of cameras, wind protection, and then putting lavs on people when you can. Those are kind of the three big things. And then if you're able to, number four is like scoping out where you're going to be shooting ahead of time.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so if is there like a base gear suggestion that you would have? So I've always wanted to film a scripted short film, but
Mhm.
I feel like the audio, if it's not good, it would be so distracting. I'm just afraid.
Yeah.
So if it's like you're in a house, you're in one room, you're filming two actors. Is there like a base audio suggestion that's like, okay, you can film this and you can get something that's going to be like not terrible
Yeah.
audio wise?
No, for sure. And you're right that like just bad audio is really distracting. So you always want to, especially for like amateur film, if you're just starting out, like doing narrative stuff, if you can learn how important audio it is early, it'll help a lot. And I know from my friends who are festival screeners that that's one of the things that like immediately turns them off is if there's bad audio. But yeah, for like a really basic setup, which like you said, for narrative films is often like two people in one location in one like discrete span of time. Uh, always have some kind of like decent field recorder. Sometimes people record just into their phones, and I don't really suggest that. So, like you were talking about the H6, that's a decent recorder. I personally recommend the F6, which is another Zoom product, but it's just a little more ergonomical, honestly. Like it's a little easier to use on set. So some kind of recorder like that. You always want at least one shotgun microphone that you can boom with, so you can boom operate over your actors, and then one lavalier wireless mic for each person that has a speaking role. So if you have two actors, two lav mics, and then yeah, one shotgun, two lavs into some kind of field mixer with headphones and, setting up a boom pole for your shotgun mic. And that's pretty much all you need for like a very basic audio kit for sort of a simple film. I did that setup for years and it simple and sweet. It will work well. You'll have coverage from different microphones. And if you have a good boom operator, you can get really good audio with something like really clean and simple.
Where do you hide the lavaliers? Because like, what if their shirts all, on their thing or their hair and stuff? Because I never see actors with, I never see it. I just don't know how they're getting away with it. And it's cool.
Yeah, yeah. So it's funny because I feel like once you know where they hide them, if you look for it, it's actually a lot easier to find mics in like Netflix and Hulu shows than you think it is. But typically they put lav mics sort of like in the sternum area, uh, so sort of where the chest like kind of dips a little bit, so the microphone can kind of sit in this little pocket. But you can hide a lav mic anywhere. Some people will hide them in hats like this. You can sort of hide them like right at where the hat meets the bill. You can hide them in corners of jackets. They can be under hair if they're mic'd properly. But a lot of the times, the way that we do it is, I'll show you guys what this looks like. Let me share my screen. The stuff people use for like a lot of people use it for their feet. If they need to like tape up their feet for running, but it's called moleskin. You can get it at like um, CBS or Walgreens or something. It looks like this. It's like adhesive athletic tape kind of stuff. And basically, we create what's called like a moleskin sandwich where you put like a square pad of moleskin, you put your lav mic on it, and then you adhere like a second layer of moleskin on top. And so that way your microphone is isolated from like rubbing up against other surfaces and it's like really stationary. That's one of the keys with laving and laving well is, you know, One of the big downfalls of lavs is that clothing noise, any kind of rustle is going to get picked up really easily by them. But if you isolate the lav within its own like little cocoon using moleskin or athletic tape or something like that, you can really cut down on the amount of clothing noise. And the moleskin's like kind of thick and cushiony, so it'll sort of like smooth out like the bulge that would be created by like the microfoam capsule. So that's like the basic way. It depends on the costuming. You always want to try your lav like miking position if you're able to beforehand instead of just like showing up on set and being like, this is how I'm going to do it. Because different costumes are harder or easier to lav. Different fabrics show the lav more. Like, obviously, if they're wearing something super tight, that's going to be a lot harder to lav than like a loose t-shirt is. But the basic way we do it is with moleskin, and then you just run the cable down the inside of the clothes and you hide the transmitter pack, usually on the inside of the pants. It has like a metal clip that you can clip on the inside of the pants, or on like the back of a bra or some kind of like waistband or something like that. Um, and then the other thing, part of the reason you don't see lavs a lot of times is they're actually moving the transmitter pack between shots. So like if they're shooting from like the front, you're seeing someone's front, they'll have a lav pack on the back of the pants. And then if you're shooting the reverse, they'll just swipe, move the lav pack to the front of the pants because it is big enough where it will bulge. So it requires a lot of attention to actually lav people where you can't see it. And if you have something tight on, then you're also going to be able to see the cable running down. So maybe you have to run the cable down the shoulder, or maybe you're going to run it like you're going to have the transmitter pack on the bra. So you only have to run it like a little bit down the very spine of their back. So it takes a lot of adjustment, and sometimes in between shots, you're doing adjustments to make sure you don't see it. Particularly with like 4K, you can see everything. So you have to be very careful of the microphone showing underneath clothing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Dayton, it looks like you have one.
I do. Earlier, when you were talking about your dialogue workflow, you mentioned you'll start by kind of on a per scene basis, making a selection for your favorite audio source. Then I'm curious when you're kind of making track selections. Is that happening like you pick one track to kind of go through for one scene and then you'll listen to all of them again for the following scene? You'll pick that one. Is it usually that you'll also start cleaning the dialogue once you've made that selection for that scene, or do you normally just make your selections for each preferred microphone, for whatever point in the scene it is, and then come back around and make another lap?
Yeah, this is a purely like subjective question. Every dialogue editor is going to tell you something different.
Okay.
I tend to work in like discrete passes, so I'll do like one big pass where I'm pulling select channels, like you're saying, and I usually do like a rough volume leveling also because some channels are going to come in a lot lower than others, and so I'll do like one pass throughout the whole project of just like pulling select microphones and doing like a rough volume adjustment. And then I'll go back around and start like adjusting edit points where like maybe in the edit their word got slightly cut off, or like a breath happens unnaturally or something like that. I'll do a second pass of that where I'm just like cleaning up all the edit points. And then usually a third pass, I start doing like noise reduction, cleaning up like mouth clicks. Maybe I heard a crew member join like the set in the background or something like that. And I'll start cleaning up those things. But I tend to work in passes. Some of my mixer friends are insane and they just like do a little bit here and a little bit here and they jump around. And then some people sort of work like a minute at a time thing and then move on, and then everything and then move on. But all of us at least initially sort of like listen through the channels and see, okay, are there any problems? Because like if you have a scene where you started out editing with the lav, but the lav cuts out halfway through, you have to go like redo all that work with a different microphone. And so usually we all do like some sort of like rough listen through of all the channels just to see if there are any like really problematic spots.
So let's say it's like a documentary context and one of your mic dies and there's someone else's dialogue gets more interesting during the scene. So you're going to be and the final version, listening to some mixed version of that, like I usually is, I imagine, for other stuff. When you're talking about making those selections in like your first pass, are you adding kind of in your version, kind of in and out points to kind of mark these changes, or how do you tend to approach it?
I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're asking. Can you?
Yeah, like when you're talking about making the kind of mic selection for a scene, what do you do when you have, say, you want to use one microphone for one part of the scene and then another one for the other part? Will you just kind of will you make those decisions on that first pass?
Yeah, sometimes too I have to revert. Like sometimes I think this project I'm working on tonight is a good example where, we had some scenes where the lav like completely cuts out, and so I had to kind of figure out, okay, am I going to use the shotgun mic because they're dancing in these really reverberant dance studios, so the shotgun mic doesn't sound that great, or am I going to try to like pick out their voice from someone's mic who was close to them? And I made the decision early that I was going to use the shotgun mic, and then I'm actually going back through tonight, and I'm like, nope, can't do it, and I'm just going to go back and undo my work and redo it with microphones that are close to them. So it's kind of an evolving thing. Sometimes you don't know how well something's going to clean up or not until you start in on like actually cleaning it up. So typically the way that it works is that we have what we call work tracks and alt tracks, where the work tracks are the tracks where you pull up like your original audio before you started like rendering noise reduction or whatever else onto it. So you have the original audio clip maintained. And then the alt tracks are alternate channels that are also good or also could work that you can quickly pull from. So if I have a scene where like maybe there were two shotgun mics running and a lav, and all three of those microphones sound good, but I think I'm going to go with the lav, I'll pull those two shotgun tracks up to the alt tracks so that if I actually decide later, no, like I'm using the shotgun mic for everyone else in this scene, so I'm going to use it for this person too, I can like quickly just grab it and swap it out. So we do like our best guess initially, and then it sort of evolves as you go and you try stuff. A lot of sound mixing is listening to something one day, leaving it alone for 2 days, and then coming back and being like, no, I hate it. And then you change it. So it sort of just shifts as you work.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Yeah. Anyone else have questions, post or production?
Hi, I have another question.
Yeah.
Um, throughout your time working with audio, what are some of the like most important things you've learned through experience?
Yeah. Um, Definitely just because you've used a lot of audio gear, don't think that you can necessarily just jump in with new gear and use it like flawlessly the first time. It is true that like if you've used one field recorder, most field recorders are like similar. Or if you've used one mixing board, most mixing boards, you can at least like kind of see what's going on with them. But every like piece of audio gear has its own quirks. Also, just things being in slightly different places can take a really long time to figure out where they are. I remember when I was prepping to teach intro to field audio, I typically don't use Zoom products. I'm just prefer a different brand. Zoom is perfectly fine. I just have mostly worked with other audio brands. And on the F6, like I couldn't figure out how to turn on phantom power for the longest time. And that would have really sucked if I had gone to class trying to teach a bunch of people how to turn on phantom power and I didn't know where it was because it was just in a slightly different place than like I'm used to finding how to turn that specific setting on. So when I was younger, like right out of college doing field audio stuff, I sometimes didn't know my gear as well as I should have. And it really only takes a couple of hours at most to go through like a piece of audio equipment and like go through the menus and figure out where everything is. Um, the other thing that I do now that I didn't always do when I was younger is I always take like physical notes. So I actually have like a notebook on me all the time where I'm writing down like different things about like, okay, how do I do this? How do I do that? Something about like the physical act of writing things down helps me remember it better, but also I have like notes to refer to if I just like can't quite remember what was that setting that I don't remember what it is, but I know it's really important. I can just like go to my notes and go and see what that thing was that I don't quite remember, and maybe I don't have time to like pull up the manual. I just like have my notes here and can reference them. Pretty much any like really disastrous problem can be solved by knowing your gear and like taking good notes about the things that are new to you. And those are honestly, those are probably the major things. It's just making sure you really, really know your gear.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mhm. Anything else? I can go through my notebook and I'll just read you guys verbatim all of my things from my notebook, including different tabletop systems that I can't remember all the rules to. Nothing. If not, I know Doug has some icebreakers that we can go through if Doug is here. If not, I'll answer them myself. But before I do that, does anyone have any other, like, even if it just seems small, any question you want to ask?
Yeah, I have a question on the okay, so with the dialogue editing part, do you have a general workflow of what corrections you make first once you are trying to start cleaning up the repair?
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good question. So typically I try to work what we call non-destructively first. So what I mean by that is some things like in video editing, like you render something onto a clip and that is destructive. Like you're even if you're keeping a copy of the original clip, which I always suggest people do, you are creating a new clip that has like specific properties rendered into them. So I try to do as much correction non-destructively first as I can. Most professional mixers work this way also, where like say there's like a low end rumble in a clip that I really need to get rid of. Instead of like rendering some kind of effect onto it, I'll use non-destructive processes to get rid of it instead. So like the big thing is EQ, where instead of like actually affecting the properties of the clip, I'll have a plugin running that is in real time, like applying those changes, but isn't actually like destroying anything within the clip itself. So usually I'll start with those kinds of changes first, just because they're super easy to undo and I'm not actually like overwriting any data. And then from there, I'll do really light passes of like noise reduction or declicking or decrackle or something like that. And I tend to work in very like gentle passes and kind of build up. Uh, Trying to like strong arm too much, like especially with digital information, can result in like basically you start hearing how digital something is, basically. So I try to do as much as I can without rendered plugins first, and then I move on to rendered plugins. But typically, I do like a rough volume level, and then I try to adjust what I can with EQ, and then I go into more like hard-fisted sort of like noise reduction stuff, which is gonna affect your audio a lot more than something like EQ is going to. I think typically most people tend to work that way, especially because most dialogue editors, like we tend to use noise reduction sparingly. We only really use it when we have to, um, which is becoming more common because the world is very noisy. But ideally, you wouldn't have to apply noise reduction at all because it does affect like the presence and the richness of people's voices. So we try not to use it unless it's like we're listening to it back in a big mix room and we're like, it's just a bit more noise than what's comfortable to listen to. And some of that noise can also be removed with more advanced, like software plugin stuff. Like there's something called multi-band compression that we try to use sometimes. Basically, you can isolate like frequency ranges that you want to compress, and so it can like do more selective frequency attenuation that is also not destructive. But that's getting a little kind of advanced to talk about without showing you guys what I mean. But we usually start with non-destructive and then move on to destructive. And then a lot of times we end up peeling back some of those layers because we've gone too far. It's really easy to lose perspective when you're listening to the same thing over and over. So a lot of times like the day after we'll come back and we're like, actually, we can go back a little less. Like we can ease up on this noise reduction a little bit. And I think that's how most, at least all the dialogue editors that I know, that's we all kind of work the same way. All right. Any other questions? No? Okay, it's time for an icebreaker. Let's see what we got. Okay, Doug says, what's your go-to method for handling unwanted or unwanted background noise on set? Handling unwanted background. It's tough because background noise, like that can mean a whole lot of different things. But one thing that I notice that not enough people do is unplug fridges when they're on set. You don't have to leave it unplugged the whole time. Obviously, we don't want all the food going bad inside. But when you're actively rolling, fridges are really tricky, especially like looking at it from a post-production standpoint. If I get a bunch of audio that has a fridge cycling in the background, it's going to oscillate between the fridge is on and the fridge is off. So you might have like a shot where one actor is talking and the fridge is like, kind of vibrating in the background, and then the reverse shot, which you shot a little bit later, but you're, trying to play as continuous time in the film, and they're talking and there's no fridge. And really like inconsistent noise is really hard to deal with. The solution in that case is to cut more noise in behind like the actor who's talking and the fridge isn't running. And what would be ideal, obviously, is to have no fridge running. So trying to unplug like appliances and electronics is really important. Sometimes computers and lights, like fluorescent lights especially, buzz a whole bunch. The reason I am working so late tonight is that I am desperately trying to get rid of like some really gnarly buzz from some fluorescent lights in a dance studio. And I've been at it for like 3 hours and it's not coming out. Like it's over. I've done what I can and you can hear what they're saying, but there's a whole bunch of like really, really intense buzzing going on behind them. This is a documentary that I'm working on in this specific instance. So it's, you have more leeway. People are more willing to accept that this is the real world. And so it sounds a little dirtier. But if you're doing a narrative film, you really need to suspend their disbelief. And it's hard to do that when you have really distracting noises. So yeah, turning off fluorescent lights, unplugging fridges, definitely turning off AC units, especially AC in Texas is so loud. The units are so big that it's just like you can't really deal with it once it's on. And that's not something that we can remove all of in post-production, unfortunately. Also, if you're outside, like holding for airplanes, which is getting harder in Austin now that it's a more populated city. Like when I moved here over 10 years ago, it was actually a lot easier to shoot outside because there weren't as many flight paths. But it's really important to pause for planes. Because they're moving, you've got the Doppler effect going, and so their frequency isn't consistent, and it becomes a lot harder to take out because of that. Um, and then a big thing is just like trying to identify where the noise is coming from, because sometimes it is something really weird, like there's a cooler in the garage that's making a weird noise, or someone left the dryer running, or something like that. So just like taking the time to scope your location out and figure out, okay, if I'm hearing a lot of background noise, what actually is that? And is it something that we can turn off? Because there are going to be situations where you can't. And if you can't turn those appliances or those machines off, just like telling the director, hey, we're not allowed to do this, but this is going to affect your audio. So like when I was in school, we did a shoot in a diner, and there were like two big industrial fridges in the back. There was a beer fridge up front and like a cake fridge that also had fluorescent lights in it. And we weren't allowed to turn any of that off, which sucked because they were very loud. All of those things were really loud. And so we actually ended up like flipping the blocking of the scene so that the microphones would be pointed away from all of that stuff. And that ended up really helping how bad like the audio quality was. Like it was much better because we actually took the time to swap the blocking instead of just like trying to push through the noise. Once again, I ask for your questions. My lovely ask me anything peoples.
What would you say to people trying to have like freelance film careers and stuff in Austin? Like everyone, so my whole life, it's like the industry is coming to Austin, industry's coming to Austin. You know, there's like always that storyline going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder, because I feel like in LA, there's like 3,000 jobs. And then in Austin, there's like you're competing for 100 jobs and everyone has friends with you know, I don't know, what would you say to somebody that wants to be full-time creative in Austin, but maybe is having trouble or it's just not really, you know, whereas like in LA, it's like super easy, but then when you're here, it's just not as easy.
Yeah. I will say recently, like past 2 years, it's been a lot harder in LA. There's been a lot of industry moving out of California in general. So you're not wrong. Like there's more industry out there. Like the whole city is built around entertainment in a way that Austin or Texas as a whole, because there's a lot of work in Dallas and Houston too, is not set up the same way. But the what you're saying about like, it's like friends of people, that's very true in Austin, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. Like if you're on the outside looking in, it feels very hard to break into like the inner circle or whatever. But once you know one person, it becomes very easy to get to know everyone else. So programs like this are great, like getting to know your classmates, because there are like sort of like cohorts of people that mostly, not always, but are around the same age that sort of like move through these life cycles in Austin. Um, and knowing like the people who are also like in your same position trying to break into the industry is actually really useful because as soon as one of you gets a break, they kind of saddle up and like rally everyone else and bring them onto their sets. Uh, but also just like going to different meetups, trying to go to screenings of things. Like, if you have the ability to volunteer at South by or AFS or AFF, sorry, and like go to festivals, you can meet a lot of people who work in the state and they'll remember that and reach out to you. If you say, hey, I'm Valerie and I like doing this. Like, can we work together in the future? A lot of times the answer is yes. Getting to know your instructors at the Austin Public is also really good because they're all working professionals. And so they have contacts and have like broken in at least to a sector of this kind of tight knit community. But a lot of it is just honestly luck. Like, I hate to say it, but it's just like kind of being in the right place at the right time. Um, but the other thing is that the Austin film industry, it is growing. It's never going to be that like explosive, this is the new film capital of the world, which is what everyone always says. But even just in my time in Texas, I've been here 12 years now. Uh, it's grown a lot. And like the facility I work at, that I'm in right now, like there are people who have been working full time in film here since the 70s. So like there is work. It's just like finding the right circles and finding the right filmmakers. Like, the studio, we mix all of Rick Linklater's movies. And like that's just one person who is responsible for like a pretty successful studio. So just like finding the right person who's got the right impetus and knows how to jingle the right pockets, and shake the money free is really, really important. Um, and then also just like keep making stuff, keep practicing because you want to be able to like take advantage of that opportunity when it comes your way and like really like prove yourself. Like for me here, I had to take, we were paid for it, but we had to do like a test dialogue edit to be able to work here. So we got paid as like a contractor and they paid us to see how good we were basically. And I had been practicing for a long time by then. And so when the opportunity to work at this place, which I had always wanted to work at, came, I was ready and I was able to do well enough to like get on the crew here. So it's a lot of timing, it's a lot of luck, and then also just trying to meet people and also just like genuinely trying to make friends. One of the reasons I like the Austin film community so much is that it's mostly like it's a very like amicable sort of place. It is based on friendship, a lot of it, instead of just like bottom line profit. And so like an indie filmmaker isn't going to get like 100,000 residual from a movie, but if they all really care about the project and care about each other, it's like easy to get on the crew there. So yeah, just trying to like just chipping away at it. And it does take a while, but eventually um, it becomes easier the more people you know. Like after a while, I kind of knew all the audio people in town and like everyone kind of knows me. And that's a good spot to be in because we all sort of like share work and pass jobs around. And like if I can't take on a project, I'll recommend a friend of mine and just sort of like share things. So there's not like one answer, but that's my insight at least.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? They can also be about freelancing in general, because I've been technically I'm still a freelancer, sort of. I contracted a few spaces, but I've been freelancing since 2016, so almost 10 years. And if you guys just have that kind of questions, I can also answer that. If not, I'm pulling the icebreaker sheet back up.
Okay, so I have a question. I'm curious if you've ever worked with acoustic instruments like violins and cellos, and if you have any tips for recording them.
Mm, yeah, I have actually recorded mostly cellos before. Man, more than anything else, those kinds of instruments really depend on the space that you're in. Um, so I can show you the other studio that I work at. Um, so in that studio space, there's like a few different people who own rooms, and um, a few of the rooms are owned by musicians. And actually, just the other day, they were doing strings. But a lot of miking like acoustic instruments is the space that you're in. You're not dealing with amplifiers and things like that. So you have to just kind of like record the space as it is like naturally, or the sound as it is naturally dispersing in space. Okay, I finally found the website. So I can share my screen again. So for instance, at this space, we have, well, I have to move my screen. So we have this really big open studio A is the studio there, and you can see like there's a lot of space in here. There's a lot of room for like natural decay of the instrument, which for strings is really important. It's really easy for strings to sound like we call it like sound canned. Um, and that's when they're recorded in like too dead of a space. So actually having like a sort of like lively space is really important. The other thing I'd say is not miking them too close. Like you don't want to be like feet away, but you want to like if this is your cello and this is your microphone, you don't want to be like up against it. You want to have like a little bit of space between the two because then the microphone will pick up that natural like disbursement of the particles like of the actual like air pressure moving around. If you mic too close, you also get a lot of resonance from the body of the wood, especially with cello, but with violin, you can also get too much of the scratch of the string instead of like the actual resonance of the sound. And so for specifically for strings in particular, miking just a little bit further away, and then also having like a nice room, or like if you can record in an empty concert hall or something, that's killer. Like that sounds great. You don't have to do a ton in post production. And then if you have multiple microphones, try miking it from different angles, just to see what you like. Pianos, especially, have a lot of interesting sound depending on where you're miking them. Like if you have a microphone hanging above the actual like harp of the piano, it sounds a lot different if the case is closed or open. If you're miking like close or far from the strings, if you're miking underneath the body of the piano or up above. And so if you have the option to record with like a few different microphones, I would suggest doing that, just because in like your mix or whatever, you can listen through those channels and be like, okay, well, actually, I like this one that's slightly closer or slightly further away. But the big thing, especially with like orchestra level instruments, is recording in like a good space and not recording like too close.
Awesome, thank you.
Mhm. Any other questions? I'll
I
have
have a
to,
question on editing.
yeah.
So, when I'm in the studio, the big studio, Studio One,
Mhm.
if I have two people talking or even three, but I'm just getting that one track. I'm not like, even though I'm miking three people with lavaliers and stuff, I'm just recording the one track. I'm not like getting the whole rigmarole. Um, if people talk over each other, what's like the editing solution to not make it as annoying for the listener when there's just one track?
That is $1 million question.
Yeah, I mean, I just
So,
don't know. Like, it's like, what's like a good option?
yeah, I mean, if people are talking over each other, you don't have a lot of options. So if you're recording like a mix down, a single track, um, you really just kind of have to live with it. If your live mix wasn't exactly what you wanted, once like voices start bleeding from one microphone into the other, there's like not a lot you can do. So, if I'm mic'd and Dayton's mic'd and we're both talking to each other, and like my voice is bleeding into Dayton's mic and Dayton's voice is bleeding into my mic, like the damage has been done and there's not a lot that you can do, even if like you had individual tracks. Like if the signals are too close to each other, uh it's just going to be difficult to edit around. This is actually a reason that we have to like re-record actors' lines in post-production sometimes, is that if it was like an improvised thing, or like a really quick scene and they're like stepping on each other's lines too much, that makes our job as dialogue editors in post like kind of impossible to do. So a lot of times we're re-recording lines because there wasn't enough like separation between lines. Um, the only other thing is like if you have a really good mixer at the console and is able to like ride the faders pretty well, sometimes that can help. But it's, even a really great like live event engineer is not necessarily going to catch every single one, because when we're doing that kind of work, we're just anticipating, so it's a lot of like, how fast are your reflexes and how quick is your attention span, and like that just becomes its own really difficult thing. Even the best engineers can't catch every single time like someone's going to be talking over each other. So the best solution is to be able to record like isolated channels instead of a mix down. But if you're dealing with a mix down track, sometimes you just gotta live with it, unfortunately.
Is there a nice way to like tell talent, do whatever you want, but don't, if someone's talking, to be quiet? Well, like is there a nice way to say that? You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
totally. And that's a lot of like new actors we have to have this conversation with, of like, hey, like I need you to react to them, and I understand that like this is going to inhibit your performance a little bit, but like I need you to wait. I need you to wait to start like reacting until you're sure they're done. Um, a lot of times, usually I just explain like the audio issues that it causes, and like try to be very earnest with them about like, I'm not saying you're being rude for interrupting, but what I am saying is that in post-production with the audio that we have set up, we won't be able to fix it if you like step on their answer or like interrupt their question. So like if you can give people space to talk, that'll make the edit a lot easier. Most people, in my experience, are very like amenable to that. They don't get offended by it. But then also, if they're not used to doing live recording, they don't always remember. And so sometimes, even if they're trying, they're not going to do it perfectly, you know. But having just like a very upfront conversation with them about like, this is why I'm asking you to do this, usually people respond well to that.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question for you. How effective are the tools at this point for dealing with compressed source audio?
Like
Uh,
distorted source audio or like,
just a lot of compression. Let's say like a poor microphone source, but let's say it was otherwise, in a decent enough room. And I'm thinking about it particularly in a documentary context when there's, say you couldn't be there somewhere and they send a voice memo with their hand holding their phone up to their mouth or something like that.
ah, oh, yeah, that is still really difficult to fix, unfortunately. The reason why is because here I can share my screen again to sort of explain this. Um, so when we're dealing with like, okay, let me type this in and then I'll share my screen. So with like an overdriven signal is kind of what you're describing. So if I share my screen again,
And that
so
means
what's
it's just pulling
happening?
too much gain, or what does the overdriven mean?
Yeah, so overdriven means that like it's yeah, it's there's too much gain and it's hitting some kind of like ceiling of some sort. So for instance, if we're talking about something that's clipped, you can see here that like if this is our original waveform where it has these nice like soft peaks, when something gets clipped or overdriven, it gets cut off. And what's happening a lot of times when you're hearing like super over compressed audio is that it's going through this first stage where it is actually clipping, but then there's some sort of like built-in software. Phones have this. Some field recorders have this where it attempts to like redraw this original signal here to the best of its ability. And that's a problem for post mixers because clipped audio like this, if it's minor clipping, we can actually do something about that. We can actually fix that a little bit. But when the waveform gets redrawn from clipped back to like this phone or whatever, like trying to re-establish the original shape, the software that we use to fix clipping doesn't see clipping anymore. It sees an intact audio file. It sees something that has like normal curves instead of like sections where there's lost data from these hard cuts. And so like overdriven lavs or a phone audio, something like that, can actually be really difficult to do much about just because the programs that we use don't recognize it, that there's something wrong. Um, this doc I'm working on, there's a couple of sections where the mic, what was happening is that the lavalier mic, the wireless signal going from the transmitter into the receiver is distorted. But then the receiver going into the mixer, since it's already been distorted, the mixer is not reading that as distortion now. It's reading that as like a normal signal because it's already reached like the voltage threshold. And so when it's going into the mixer, it's going in at an appropriate level because it's already been cut off. The extra information has already been lost. And so when we get these files in post production, it looks normal, but you're listening to it, you're like, gosh, that sounds terrible. And there's not a ton we can do there, unfortunately. Um, that's something that this process called interpolation can sometimes help. It's kind of like 20% of the time it works, 80% of the time it doesn't. But there's not a lot of sophisticated tools to really deal with that, at least that I'm aware of. That's one of those kind of like fatal flaws that if it happens, it's like really hard to fix.
Yeah, that's what I was curious about. If at this point, with how good other AI models had gotten, if they could essentially take other signal and then reproduce gaps in that coverage with, say, clipping or adding richness to a voice that is otherwise recorded on a poor microphone.
Yeah, and there are some tools that like try to add back frequencies that maybe like a bad microphone never picked up in the first place. It's kind of coin toss if those actually work. Sometimes they work really well, sometimes they don't, but it's sort of hard to say until you test it. Um, but if you know if you're doing something like a documentary, you can get away with a lot. You can get away with like pretty bad audio in a documentary, just because people aren't expecting the same level of like polish that you would have in a set where you have like a closed environment. So like this doc, there's a few sections where we just had to subtitle it because there's dancers who aren't wearing microphones. There's microphones on cameras, but the cameras are far away to capture the performance, and there's like music playing, and so like they're talking, you can't hear them at all. Like, but we subtitle it, and it's okay, and no one really cares. So you do have more leeway with doc than you do with anything else, which is good.
Yep, I'm kind of in certain context betting on it.
Yeah.
When you mentioned earlier about having harsh cuts, are you referring to kind of just the moment when the cut's made that you get in the edit that it's just kind of in the middle of a word or something about the sound is off there, or does that mean something else?
No, yeah, it's exactly that. Because picture editors, they're doing their best with audio, and obviously, they're often listening to the interviews and stuff to like find the spot where they need to cut off this thought or whatever. But they're not focusing on like making that cut sound good. They're a lot of times focused on, okay, this is the information we need to hear, and let's cut the picture here because that's their job. It's not their job to make the audio sound good. And so, a good example is reality TV. We do a little bit of that here. If you are interested in audio at all and you want to cut your teeth as a dialogue editor, reality TV is great because a lot of times, surprising no one, reality TV is very fake, and they cut like they'll cobble a whole sentence together from a bunch of different takes, and people aren't even in the same place sometimes, and then they like make it sound like one consistent sentence, even though it's like I was from day one and then sad from day 10, and they made I was sad. And so for reality TV, we do a lot of that like smoothing out of cuts to make it sound like it's one complete sentence. Even in documentaries sometimes, like maybe you're preserving the integrity of what this person is saying, but like they sort of like went off on a tangent in the middle of this thing they were telling you and then came back around to it, and there's like sort of an ugly sounding audio cut. Like we'll try to make that better. Or sometimes like you want the scene to end at a certain point, like they said something really profound and you want to cut, but like they kind of kept talking after that. And so we try to make it sound like it's the end of their sentence. So sometimes we'll like stretch the word. Sometimes we'll actually pitch the word down a little bit to make it sound like this is where they were stopping their thought instead of them saying, I was sad and then I was happy. Like we try to end it on I was sad and cut it out there, and make that cut sound natural. Um, but sometimes too, it's just like shifts in room tone, you know? Like unfortunately this dance scene I'm working on, the fluorescent lights don't ring at the same frequency the whole time. So I'm like trying to crossfade different ambience into one another so that you don't hear like a really harsh snap in room tone from one shot to another. So making it all seem very smooth and even uh, is a lot of what you're doing with dialogue editing.
I'll have plenty of questions, so everybody feel free to jump in and out on me.
Yeah, any other questions? Because I also still have some of Doug's icebreakers, so I can keep going. If not, though, Dayton, feel free to ask whatever you want.
Well, anybody feel free to cut me off along the way then. Um, One of the things I was curious about was how much lead time you would give somebody given the duration of a cut. I know that different cuts require different levels of labor, but generally, what would be like a good distance to contact somebody at the very least to make sure that they have a good sense of what it would require, let's say for a 90-second cut or a 2.5 minute cut?
Yeah. Honestly, the earlier the better. So most people who work with me know that like if you can send me the script before you've even shot, like hell yeah, I love that. Um, Currently, actually, there's two shorts that I'm reviewing. They just wrapped production like last week, so they don't even have assembly cuts yet. But I told them like, hey, can you send me the script because they want me to work on them? And I was like, okay, I don't really know the scope of these projects. Can you send me like an assembly or something? And they were like, well, we don't have that, but we do have the script. And so sometimes I work like kind of on stuff as early as that because at least it gives me a sense of like, okay, this is going to need a lot of sound design or this is going to be kind of natural or whatever, or this is going to need a lot of dialogue editing, or this is going to need no dialogue editing, whatever. But generally, once there's a decent rough cut that has like at least the foundation of like the artistic vision laid out, doesn't have to be perfect, just like something, that's a good place to send it to a mixer and ask them like, hey, what do you think about this? What kind of work do you think this needs? How long do you think this would take? You know, all of those kinds of like scheduling questions. So like a solid rough cut is usually where people bring me in. Again, there's just folks that I work with a lot who know that I like to be in earlier than later, so they just like send me stuff as soon as they have script or as soon as they've wrapped production or something.
And what's the kind of norms there? Because, obviously that involves more time on your behalf, if you catch a script as opposed to, getting the picture lock. So kind of how's that general, like what are the appropriate norms for kind of getting folks bought in on it earlier, or at least giving them opportunity for it?
Yeah, so I generally um I kind of roll it into the same bid. So it honestly, if I get started on a project earlier, in some ways it could actually save us time because I can say, hey, like you're going to need to do this on set in order to avoid this problem, or like you need to watch out for this to avoid this issue. Or if they have a rough cut, I can be like, hey, we're going to have to re record some of this stuff. Let's go ahead and start getting that set up now instead of like last minute having to scramble and rebook your actors and figure out a way to do that kind of stuff. So typically, like prep work for me doesn't cost more necessarily. Like if I'm doing, let's say, like I'm doing a short film in a very specific location and I need like specific environmental sounds. Even if I don't have the final cut, I can start collecting sounds in my free time, and that just saves me time during sound design where I already have some stuff that I can pull from. And that's pretty common. Like one of the last films we mixed here, it's a period piece in the 40s, and there's these big like cocktail party scenes. And so we knew we were going to have like period voices looping in the background, which is not something that you can just like find. So we had to make all of that. And we knew that early. And so we like started working on like recording my voice and other crew members' voices and like talking about the subway fare has gone up to a nickel or whatever, you know, and like recording that in the background. And that was work that we just were able to do sooner. And it didn't necessarily like cost more. It just like takes some of the pressure off because often sound gets really constricted timelines for stuff. Like an editor will get 3 months for something that we get 2 weeks for. And expecting us to work like that sometimes is unrealistic. Sometimes it just straight up can't happen. Like we can't do it in that time. Like if we had had to record these cocktail party voices in a week instead of like the 4 months that we had to do it, it wouldn't have happened. Like it just, there would not be time in the day to do it. And so, like, a lot of like getting sound people involved early is just saving them stress. And it also like gives your project more time to like breathe and they have more time to like come back to the iterations of the project and like let it sit. Um, a lot of good sound mixes, the only thing that they have, like the only advantage they have over like bad sound mixes is time. Just giving them like time to reset their ears and sort of like tweak things. And that doesn't necessarily always costs more money.
Okay, that's useful nuance because that's not things I would have had to come to on my own. What kind of process do you have for starting to build the sound design? Like, I imagine you'll watch a rough cut or you'll get your script. Do you have a sort of process at this point where you say, okay, I want to think about what are these things going to be looking like first, or I want to think about what I would want to hear in some of these beats. How do you approach it?
Yeah, obviously it depends on the project, but in general, for me personally, and again, this is going to vary depending on what sound designer you talk to. I like to start with ambience first, like establishing how does the world sound? Like where are we? Like maybe time period, but also like what time of day is this? Like is it okay, it's daytime, obviously, if we're shooting outside and it's light out, but is this the morning? Is this the afternoon? Because the sounds of the birds, the sounds of the bugs change depending on like what time of day it is. Same with night. Like, okay, it's dark, it's night. Is it early evening? Is it the witching hour? Is it pre-dawn? Like where are we? Because the sounds are going to change. And so I usually almost exclusively I start with laying in ambience and like getting a sense of the shape of the world and also like how busy is this world? How static is it? Like a lot of sound design is thinking beyond the screen. Like, okay, you're shooting in a park. Is this park close to a school? Is it close to a church? Are you hearing church bells? Is it close to a highway? Is it kind of noisy? What does it sound like outside of what you're seeing? And so ambience really helps me like get my brain into like the environment that the characters are in. And so that's almost always where I personally start. The only exceptions are like if I have a sound design sequence with like a monster or like something that needs like a very specific, like curated, like bespoke kind of sound. Like I did this one project last year where there was this like shadowy smoke monster thing that was like abducting people in the abandoned tunnels below a highway. And I knew on that one, I was like, I got to start with the monster. Like, I have to figure out what this thing sounds like because I know it's going to take me a while to like find the right thing. But if I'm not dealing with something like that, it's always ambience. And even for that project, once I kind of figured out how the monster sounded, I went back to ambience and then came back to the rest of the sound design, like footsteps and flashlights and weird gurgles and things like that, you know.
That makes sense.
But again, that's going to be different sound designers have different preference. That's just my personal preference.
Right. No, that's interesting.
Any other questions from AJ or Adrian? Looks like Valerie had to go. Dayton, you got anything else?
Sure. Um, when when you get to your mix, do you have an order between reverb, panning, and EQ? Oh, and compression, I imagine those are probably the big things.
Yeah, we use less compression in film than you might imagine. We kind of just use it for like a little bit on dialogue and sometimes to get like a certain punch from a sound effect. For me, once I'm mixing, I kind of do all those things at once. So once I've got like a rough level on everything, that's the one thing I tend to deal with first with the mix is like if the sound effects are too hot or the dialogue's too quiet, like that's the big thing I do first. It's just like rough level everything. But once I'm done there, I kind of just go moment by moment and I sort of am like, okay, well, this car moves from left to right. So, like, let's put some pan on that. And, like, I need the car to sound quieter and then get louder and sound quieter again. Or, like, this voice isn't really matching that voice. So I need to add some reverb here or something like that. I kind of just work like moment by moment and sort of adjust all those things kind of at once, especially because sometimes they kind of inform the other. Like, if I'm gonna pan something, but it also needs to have reverb on it, that's gonna affect how much I pan it. Or like maybe someone's supposed to be like yelling from another room, and so I'm like doing EQ to make their voice sound distant. I'm also gonna like add some reverb to kind of sell that. And so a lot of times those three things, reverb, EQ, and pan, are sort of like working together, and you got to adjust all of them to get like the effect that you
And the kind of level work, that'll be fades, that'll be just like overall kind of volume level for particular sound.
want. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And typically the way we set up our templates, most mixers do this, is we have sort of like you have like three big groups: dialogue, sound effects, music. And you have sort of like a big master volume adjustment for each of those. And of course, you have individual volume adjustment for like every single clip. But you also have these like master faders so that you can like pull, like maybe you had three dialogue editors working on a feature and one of them like edited just a little bit quieter than the others. You can use this master to like bump up all of the dialogue in one scene. Or maybe you had a scene like you have this really intense yelling scene like two-thirds of the way through your movie, and that needs to like be really loud and abrasive. You can sort of like bump down the dialogue everywhere else just a little bit and then make sure that scene stays loud. And so I'll do like a lot of that kind of stuff. Sort of like you're sort of like if you're throwing pottery or something, you're like sort of shaping how the piece is going to come out with those sort of like three main adjustments: music, effects, and dialogue.
Yeah. No, that tracks for me. The when do you start in terms of the kind of loud dealing with loudness? Do you have a particular order on what you deal with first, or is that pretty context dependent?
It's really context. Yeah, like a lot of times what we do before we start mixing is we have actually before we start sound design is we have what we call a spotting session with the director, where we'll go scene by scene through the movie together and talk about like, okay, what's like the story beat here, what's the sound that you're imagining, whatever. And part of what we do during the spotting session, at least I do, is I talk to them about like, okay, where's like the loudest point of your, like, where do you imagine like the sound being densest, having the most like dynamic range. And so if they know, we'll kind of mark that spot, and I'll sort of like sometimes I'll work down, like I'll make that as loud as I think it needs to be, and then I'll sort of like work backwards from that point. Sometimes I do it the opposite way, where I'll work like if everything else is kind of a consistent level, and then you have like this one really dynamic spot, I'll work on the consistency everywhere else, and then like really work on the dynamic range in that one particular scene. But yeah, it's super dependent on what the project is and what the artistic intent is.
Hmm. And when you're pulling in all your tracks, let's say you have, I don't know, a dozen tracks for a sequence that's a scene. Um, how do you usually map it out with setting your groups up? Is there a particular order you prefer and a way that you like to kind of patch into mixes with it?
What do you can you sort of elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think like I'm curious if you when you take in all your tracks, are they normally just split into the individual, I don't know if stem's the right word, but individual audio track. So for example, this lav, this shotgun, etc. Or do you kind of do some early mixing as soon as you get it?
Oh yeah, usually I do like a big organization first. That's like kind of step one. And so some people will arrange their like especially for dialogue tracks, they'll have like a track per character. Um, I don't work that way. It seems like it would be smart and clean, but it actually kind of makes things more difficult sometimes. So I tend to here I can actually maybe flip this around a little bit. This might seem like organized chaos, but like I tend to have like just dialogue two, three, four through to like 16 or whatever,
Mhm.
and sort of like checkerboard clips like this. And one of the first things I do when I import everything is just like sort of organize it in like alternating chunks, basically alternating clips, so that it's easy for me to sort of like go from one to the other, I guess. But We do some organization for sound effects. Like I always break it out into Foley, discrete effects, and backgrounds. And then from there, I'll break it into like, there's also like background effects. Like if I'm working on a horror movie and I want some like crows every once in a while to like caw caw in the background, I'll like have those as part of the background effects, even though they are sort of sound effects.
Mm.
But they go with the ambience. So I'll sort of like group things that way, where it's like, okay, everything that corresponds to this one area is sort of in the same spot. You know, I think that answers if that answers your question at all.
Yeah, and when you're saying checkerboarding, are you talking about with you'll just cut up the scenes in a way that makes sense for you to make discrete units? Um, or what are you referring to?
Yeah, so usually the way that we like to work in Pro Tools, which is the software that everyone who mixes films uses, we'll have like let's say on dialogue track one, you have one character's audio for the scene, and then dialogue track two, you have the other person's. So like if it's Al Pacino and Robert De Niro in Heat, and they're talking to each other. Like you've got Al Pacino on dialogue one and Robert De Niro on two, and like as they go back and forth, we can fade the clips into one another. And so instead of just like having everything in one bar, we have more discrete control over the actual like audio clip. And so like let's say in the edit, like Al Pacino's breath got cut off halfway, we can like extend that clip back and then fade it in so that you hear like a much more consistent sort of sound. And that's a lot easier if not everything is on one track, where you have things like split up where they're nearby, like they're close, you know,
Hmm.
but they're not just all like one bar of audio. You have a lot more like finesse available to you if you sort of split it up into checkerboards where you like have one clip here and then one clip here and then one clip up here and one down here, on and on. And then usually we kind of do scenes too, where it'll be like dialogue tracks one, two, and three are scene one, and then four, five, and six are two, and one, two, and three are scene three, four, five, and six are scene four.
Mm,
You know,
okay,
rotates like that.
gotcha.
Other questions? I saw Adrian unmute for a second, but I don't know. It was a false alarm.
Signs of life.
It was a false alarm. I'm still just learning and just picking everything up, so I'm much more in sponge mode.
Okay,
I will
cool.
have more questions at the next Ask Me Anything.
Sounds good. Well, yeah, any other questions? We still have half an hour, so if you've got more, I'm at your disposal.
Um,
Yeah, I know you got more, Dave.
yeah, fair.
If not, I can also pull from Doug's nice icebreaker document. Let's see. What do we got? Ooh, number two is a good one. How do you coordinate with director and camera team to ensure sound equipment doesn't interfere with shots? This is a big one that I feel like people don't think about until they're on set with like a sound mixer for the first time. Um, and they realize like how much audio and lighting especially can like come into conflict with one another, not in like an acrimonious way, but just like boom poles cast shadows and lights are often in the like the perfect spot for your sound mixer to be, things like that, just like actual blocking of crew behind the camera. And so some of the best things you can do is rehearsing with your audio crew. So a lot of times directors will ask to clear the set for rehearsal with actors and camera, and they won't ask audio to stay. And you kind of have to like push to make sure that you're staying on set for rehearsal as a sound mixer or a boom operator. And part of the reason is that you gotta, it seems obvious, but like you need to know what motion is happening in the scene to be able to follow that motion. I mean, that's huge and something that especially like newer directors don't always do is they don't always think, oh yeah, like my camera person needs to know where these actors are going and how quickly they're moving, but audio also does, especially for boom operators who, have a really physically demanding job. They need to be ready to move like at a moment's notice. And the big thing with sound is that they have to move really quietly, or else the microphone will pick up all of the crew movement. And same goes for camera. And that's something I notice a lot on short films, especially, is you'll hear crew moving in the dialogue, and it's pretty distracting sometimes. And that's because a lot of it, I think, is that they don't rehearse with sound, and so they don't have the opportunity to tell the camera operator, like, hey, you need to adjust your footfalls. Like, you can't just like slam around on the ground. You have to like heel toe very softly, or else we're going to pick up all of your noise in our microphones. Or like, if you've got someone wrangling cables, like you have to do it really quietly. If you have any kind of like walk and talk shots, those are a lot harder to do than you might think. And like, they're already like, everyone agrees that's hard to do, but like, it's even harder to do if you're rolling sound synchronously. The other thing too is just like knowing when your boom pole is in frame or not. One thing that you should always be doing before a shot, if you're a sound mixer or boom operator, is, holding your boom pole up and like slowly syncing and checking frame with your DP until they say like boom. And so you kind of know like where the top of frame is. It's a lot easier to paint a shotgun microphone out of a frame than it used to be, but it's even easier not to do that at all. So if you can avoid it altogether, it makes life easier. And the only way sound mixers are going to know where their frame line is to do rehearsal with them. Um, if you have actual like rehearsals where you're doing table reads or like blocking exercises before set, bring your sound mixer. Even table reads can give them an idea of like, oh, they're going to get really loud here. I need to like make a note on the script so that like when I'm following along, I know to adjust my levels, or like there's going to be a lot of motion here, or whatever kind of thing can get in the way. And basically just having enough prep work with your sound mixer so they know where to be on set. And then also just like as lighting is setting up, the sound mixer should be like asking them, hey, like what's the lighting going to look like for this, as they're setting up different lights, like sort of checking how the boom is going to like cast shadow around the room, making sure that they're like staying in the loop on like what's going on in the scene. Some of that is, on the impetus of your sound mixer. Some of that is the responsibility of the director. But I can't tell you how many times when I used to do field audio more consistently that I would walk into a scene and it was really complicated and I had no idea and they wanted to start rolling right then. And it's just like, okay, well, I am not ready. I didn't know that we're doing like this giant walk and talk or this like these whip pans or something like that. And so making sure that everyone's sort of like, I mean, it sounds dumb, but like everyone's communicating effectively and like making sure that everything picture knows, sound also knows, because they're going to be involved in almost all of the same issues that picture is going to be involved with. And then also your camera operators and your sound mixers need to trust each other. There's a lot of tension on set sometimes between camera operators and sound people, and it's because they don't talk a lot. Two different departments, oftentimes they don't really like interact that much, and they really should be talking and talking about shot setup and talking about actors and things like that, just like making sure that they're both on the same page. And if they do that enough, they'll trust each other and it becomes a lot easier to work together. And then, of course, director needs to be trusted and work with everyone. But if you really have your camera operator and your sound mixer in contact, it makes things a lot easier. Other questions? If not, I have talked enough for one night, talked for about an hour and a half with you guys. But I'll give one last chance for questions. And if not, we can go ahead and end this little lights, camera, ask.
Morgan, I don't have anything else, but thank you though.
Yeah, of course. Because I think,
Yeah.
Doug, we've hit basically everything in your icebreakers now. So
Yes, thank you. All this information was so helpful, and
good.
I'm very glad you guys